and welcome in. I'm Shieldbro6 for the History Armada, and today I will be your guide. Today we're talking one of my personal favorite figures of interest in American history. We're going to be talking about George B. McClellan, the man who was in charge of the Union Army at the start of the American Civil War. We're going to be talking about George B. McClellan. We're going to talk about, was he really that bad? Well, George McClellan is one of those generals who really looks great on paper. He graduated second in his class at West Point, well ahead of his classmates such as Stonewall Jackson and George Pickett. His work as an observer during the Crimean War gave him insight to the importance of logistics, and he also looked for an industrialized army. And he even spent years as the chief of engineering for the Illinois Central Railroad, which made him aware of the transformation and the nature of rail transport going on in the nation of the United States at that time period. Little Mac, as he was known, or Fighting Little Mac, as he was beloved by the Irish divisions and by the American people, would prove himself to be a superb organizer who kept his army well supplied, efficiently run, and happy, which is very important when doing campaigns during a wartime. He was also supremely gifted at overestimating the size of his opponent's army to a degree that, well, rather brought disbelief. So he gets a lot of rows and he kind of gets picked on and called a coward or a poor commander because of some of his decisions that were made during his time during the Civil War. But that is because he never wanted to face a superior force. He refused to fight, which obviously this is a problematic quality to have when he is the general-in-chief of the entire Union Army during a climactic Civil War. After months of inactivity, McClellan was finally spurred to action by President Abraham Lincoln, which forced his hand. So was he really that bad of a commander? Well, let's dive in. The resulting Peninsular Campaign from April to July of 1862 was a marvel of planning, but something of a farce when executed. You see, there was a direct overland march to the Confederate capital of Richmond, and McClellan orchestrated this to an impressive, ambitious landing of over 100,000 troops at Fort Monroe at the southeast end of the peninsula between the James and York rivers. He had planned this all, and it was beautiful on paper. In stereotypical McClellan fashion, however, he was promptly checked by a vastly inferior force under John Bankhead Magruder. Although he outnumbered Magruder's army of the peninsula 10-1, McClellan settled in for a month-long siege rather than an engagement and a rush of men. By the end of May 1862, Confederate Commanding General Joseph E. Johnston had withdrawn his forces to Richmond, and McClellan was close enough to the Confederate capital to hear its church bells ringing. Johnston was wounded on the first day of the Battle of Seven Pines, 6 miles east of Richmond, and he was replaced by Robert E. Lee. Robert E. Lee is obviously the famous commander of the Confederate Army. He took over after Johnston was wounded, and McClellan and Lee were kind of the perfect pair for each other. They knew each other well, and that caused a severe checker match of checking and balancing. Well, like I said, it was within 6 miles of Richmond, and like I said, Lee demonstrated an immediate grasp of McClellan's demeanor and tactics, and they knew each other well. And during the 7 days battle from June 25th to July 1st of 1862, Lee drove back the Union armies from Richmond's doorstep all the way back to where they started, essentially, pushing them far north. So they were within 6 miles of their goal, within 6 miles of taking Richmond, the capital of the Confederacy, but they were not able to take it. They weren't even able to have a battle for it. If McClellan hadn't spent that time sieging and used his 10-1 advantage and pushed sooner, he would have been able to possibly get there before the reinforcements had time to actually settle in, and they could have taken Richmond in this early 1862. You can see the battles of the Peninsula Campaign on the right of your screen there. So, due to this and Lee driving back the Union armies, Lincoln relieved McClellan, but reinstated him after the devastating Union defeat at the Second Battle of Bull Run. Once again, Darling Little Mac worked his organizational magic, his inept skill, his absolute... he is a man of paper and numbers. Lincoln himself said that no one can get a force ready to fight better than McClellan. If you need a man to get men together, organized, and ready to fight, McClellan was your man. He was the organizational type. So he restored the morale of a shattered Union army, and once again at the Battle of Antietam, McClellan's terminal case of, quote, the slows, as Lincoln called it, prevented the exploitation of a possible war-ending vulnerability in Confederate defenses. So yet again, we see how he was too cautious, and instead of pushing his advantage at Antietam, he withdrew, allowing the Confederacy and the Civil War to continue, just as we saw in the Peninsula. He ran as a Democrat, as I should say. It is important to mention, as we are seeing here, that after the Battle of Antietam and after he is removed, he ran as a Democrat against Lincoln in the election of 1864 for the seat of the president. A key plank in the Democratic platform that year was appropriately quoted, "not fighting," end quote. And McClellan lost in a rout, as you can see here. The electoral vote was, sorry, it's a little blurry there, but it's 91% voted for Lincoln in the electoral vote, and the 55% voted in the popular vote for Lincoln, so Lincoln won quite steadily. And I think it's kind of interesting that after being removed from his office as General-in-Chief of the Union Army, he would run against the president that had removed him and the president that had been giving him orders in the middle of a civil war. I find that very interesting that he would run for that. So it's kind of like, like I said, he was really good at numbers, so it's interesting that the Democrats would use him like that to vie for the presidential seat. And it makes me wonder what McClellan was thinking, and maybe he was applying a little too much of his general brain when doing that decision. So another interesting point we should consider, if he was really that bad of a general, why did Robert E. Lee have such a high opinion of him, his own adversary? So the most common version of Lee ranking McClellan among the war's best, if not the best, general of the Civil War is recorded in Robert E. Lee Jr.'s Recollections and Letters of General Robert E. Lee, which I actually own a copy of some of the letters during the wartime of Robert E. Lee. I got in a book sale, and it's actually really fascinating to see the correspondence and see the shift of tone and urgency throughout the war, but also to see the way he spoke about some of the Union generals, such as McClellan. So it is said of the former general, quote, which of the Federal generals had he considered the greatest? To which General Lee replied, answered most empathetically, McClellan by all odds. So he considered McClellan to be the best general of the Federal side of the Civil War by all odds. There was none that ranked beside him, according to Robert E. Lee. So Lee's statement might not have been the only thing to raise your eyebrows, because this is the Confederate general we're talking about here. His assertion was recorded only in 1904, 34 years after his death, and not by the person who Lee was talking to. However, let's not discard this yet, right? It's still a very plausible story. A wartime letter written by a friend of McClellan to the general reported that his own friend had just returned from the Confederacy, and while there, he had spoken with Lee, who had exclaimed General McClellan was the only general that Lee dreaded, that General Lee dreaded. He is the only one. Because like I said, it was kind of a checkers match, a chess match. A lot of back and forth checking of each other. Because like I said, McClellan was rather overly cautious, but Lee also respected and understood him. And Lee even praised McClellan enough for there to be a substance that he wrote these letters with high regards of him. Well, after sorting through this, and all the times Lee talked about McClellan as a general, it appears Robert E. Lee respected him in a twofold manner. Firstly, Robert E. Lee respected McClellan because he was rooted in the Federal general's soft-hand approach to the war and to the Confederacy. In November 1862, upon receiving word of McClellan's removal from command of the Army of the Potomac, Lee told Lieutenant General James Longstreet that he regretted the change in the Federal Army because, quote, "we always understood each other too well. I fear that they may continue to make these changes till they find someone who I don't understand." So, like I said, it was quite that chess match of checking each other back and forth and following each other up. But that was ultimately McClellan's downfall because President Lincoln and the Union could not hold out for this chess match because it was kind of a war of attrition on both sides. So they could not wait out to see how this would play out and what the chess game would become. Which, it's still interesting that Lee had such respect for it. But in conclusion of what I'm trying to say here, different generals and general officers excel at different things. McClellan excelled at things like training, logistics, and morale. McClellan had this idea that he was the little Napoleon of the West, but he was really more like the French general Berthier. But that's fine, there's no shame with being Berthier, because without Berthier, Napoleon would never have been Napoleon. Berthier was fundamentally important for Napoleon and his accomplishments. And after each of the Bull Run defeats, McClellan took over the army, nursed it back to health, got it back in fighting shape and in fighting spirits, and after the second Bull Run, which was an incredibly humiliating defeat for the Union at the time, he got them back in morale and in fighting order in a matter of days, which is astounding, especially if you have to consider how logistics worked, especially for 1800s warfare. The 19th century was a very different time when it came to communication, logistics, and organization. So for a general to get a crippled and humiliated army back into fighting spirits and in organized shape within days is utterly impressive. But he just wasn't a very good field commander. Some generals just aren't. McClellan knew what he was doing, and he handled his troops very well in a battle. But he was overly cautious, and he considered it kind of child's play to be the aggressor. So skilled generals like Lee that faced him down and often compelled him to retreat with a weaker, even though they had a weaker force, caused that chess match that I had mentioned earlier. Lee himself even said, quote, "He is an able general, but he is a very cautious one," end quote. And that would ultimately be his downfall in the eyes of Lincoln and the citizens of the United States. He took an enormous risk against McClellan, Lee that is, because he knew McClellan would never come at him aggressively. So that's why their chess match was able to go on for as long as it did. So was he really as bad as some of these historians say, and was he really a coward? No, I don't think he was a coward, but he definitely was overly cautious. While he was a great marshal of men and a great organizer, and he was excelling in these training and logistics, he just was not a good field commander. When it came to the actual battles and the commanding of forces in combat, he just did not have the skills to pay the bills and win the American Civil War. Well, I hope you enjoyed, and I think it is kind of important to talk about the beginning of the American Civil War with General McClellan, because that would lead us to Ulysses S. Grant and the other generals. And I feel like the American Civil War isn't often dove into enough in detail, so I hope you enjoyed, and I hope you learned something about darling Little Mac, and if whether or not he was really as bad as some historians say. You guys can make up your own minds. If you have any comments, suggestions, concerns, anything at all, leave that in the comment section down below for me. I do read all of them. If you are liking my content, please make sure you hit that like and subscribe button for me. We're almost to my goal of 400 subscribers, and you guys rock for that. If you want to check out my other links, check out the links in the description of the video. But as always, I'm ShieldBro6 for the History Armada, and thank you so much for watching. I'll catch y'all next time.